Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for taking the time out and come to hear our guest lecturer speak all the way from Melbourne, Australia, Dr. Jerry Ayers. So 14 workers die every day on the job in the U.S., which also means 14 individuals will not be able to go home and see their loved ones. My name is Behm Siddiqui, and I'm the president of the American Society of Safety Professionals. And I want to start out by thanking our North Carolina ASSP chapter for taking the time out and come. So if you guys could please give them a round of applause. I want to thank Dr. TJ Muhammad. He was the one that was part of this process, so please give him a round of applause. I want to thank our admin support, Mrs. Cindy Lowry and Mrs. Teresa Martin in the corner. And I want you guys to take notice that there are 2 fire exits on both sides. So this is safety, so please keep that in mind. And I would like you all to please silence your cellular devices or phones during the presentation out of respect for our speaker. And let's begin talking about International Workers' Day Memorial. So during this day, it happens April 28th every year, and it is a way to recognize and remember those that have lost their lives while they were on the job. So a bit about our speaker, Dr. Jerry Ayers. He has worked in the construction industry for over 25 years. He started to work as a builder's laborer and now is the manager of OHS&E of construction, forestry, and mining. He has also worked with the NSW branch of CFMEU. He has a PhD and a master's degree in OHS and a graduate diploma in occupational hazard management. He sits on numerous committees and boards and addresses all safety issues dealing with OHS. He's written numerous articles and presented many papers, both locally and internationally, on a vast range of OHS issues. He is also a guest lecturer at Melbourne University, RMIT, and Federation University. He's a strong advocate of the right of workers to be involved in workplace OHS decision-making. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jerry Ayers.
Thank you, Behm. Can everyone hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. When Professor Michael Behm very kindly asked me whether I would be interested in coming over to a visit to ECU and doing a keynote address or two to forums such as this one, my initial reaction was, sure, I'd love to. When I politely asked him whether there was any particular or specific topic he would like me to discuss or talk about, I remember he said something along the lines of, just talk about the importance of occupational health and safety for workers, their families, and the communities in which they live. And then he started to chuckle and said, that's not too much to ask, is it? At that point, I thought this might be a little bit more difficult than I had first envisaged. But he did further suggest a topic which he thought I might like to discuss within that framework which I just mentioned about the importance of OH&S for workers, their families, and their communities. And that topic was International Workers' Memorial Day from an Australian perspective. So I thought I'd try to work all of that into this presentation here today. Now what I'm initially about to say, in formally commencing this address, may at first seem a little odd. It may be a little hard to follow. Indeed, some of you may ask, where is he going with all of this and what has this got to do with the topic at hand? But I suppose it's a bit like a painting. At first, the brush strokes and the outline don't appear to make much sense. It's only when we begin to fill in more of the detail and add the fuller range of colours does the picture truly begin to reveal itself. So using words as our colours and our brush strokes, let's see if we can begin to paint our picture. Back in late November, early December last year, 2018, my family and I were lucky enough to take a 17-day holiday to Japan. It was our first visit to Japan, and hopefully it won't be our last. We initially stayed a few very exciting and fun-filled days and nights in Tokyo, then had 10 glorious and wonderful days in Kyoto, and had a very moving 2-day visit down at Hiroshima, and then went back to Tokyo for another 2 days. Now, one of the many places we visited whilst we were in Kyoto was a little area expanse known as the Philosopher's Path. Now, this path is quite close to Kyoto University. It's roughly a 2 kilometre, which I think is about 1.2 mile, winding and ever so gentle meandering stroll along cobble pathways next to a very peaceful canal with large gently swimming fish, surrounded by beautifully sculptured gardens with twittering bird life, and of course the almost obligatory cherry blossoms and the vibrant and dazzling colours of those stunning Japanese maples. Now, whilst I was walking along this philosopher's path through the light misty rain and the ever so gently lifting fog, it occurred to me that whilst I may be no great philosopher, the greatness of the health and safety philosophy, I believe, lies in or is founded upon a very basic human principle: life. To save life, to enrich life, to enable and contribute to people enjoying their life, and not just their working life, but their entire life. Because when we do OH&S well, when we genuinely commit to occupational health and safety, we prevent workers getting hurt, or worse, getting killed at work. We prevent workers contracting some insidious disease because they're not being exposed to some hideous, harmful and or toxic chemical or substance whilst at work. And not just on this philosopher's path, but whilst we're in Japan as a whole, especially when we were visiting their many beautiful and serene and tranquil Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples, their stunning and almost hauntingly quiet bamboo forests, and especially when we were visiting Hiroshima. It really made me contemplate and reflect on life in general. And whilst what I'm about to say is a very broad and perhaps generalised statement, I know, it just seemed to me that the Japanese way of life and their overall and general demeanour appeared to be very calm, very peaceful, very deliberate, and very respectful. Respectful not only of life, both past and present, but also respectful of their communities. And all of this made me stop and ponder further about the importance of life, especially in terms of family, friendships and community. And what happens to all of these things? How all of this, how all of us are affected in a most negative way, be it emotionally, spiritually and or physically, when there's a fatality at the workplace of someone we know, someone from our community. We know that when the life of someone from our community is taken at work or as a result of some work process, many other lives in that community are shattered, some never to be the same, others ruined beyond belief. Mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, soulmates, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, cousins, friends, work colleagues. Entire communities are fundamentally altered, often beyond repair. And the worst part of all of this tragedy is that far more qualified and eminent people than myself, people such as Professor Andrew Hopkins and Professor Michael Quinlan, for example, who are both acknowledged and recognised around the world for their thinking, their writings and their teachings on occupational health and safety, they all agree that all workplace fatalities are preventable. We just need to slow down a little, take heed, find the time to acknowledge and then find the time to take and implement positive action over all the pre-warnings and signs and signals and events which always occur, generally well before and prior to any tragic event or incident. And we need to find the time and take time to listen to the concerns, the ideas and the potential solutions that workers may have, especially when those pre-warnings or pre-events occur. Now, of course, there is an upside to all of this. There is good news in all of this. And that good news is all of you. All of you sitting here today, this afternoon. You're here because you care, or at least I think and I hope you care. And I think it would be fair to say that you carry with you and you believe in that great health and safety philosophy of life and the importance of that life for a community, be it a family, social or work community. Not too long ago, I was reading a book called The Book of Joy. It was written by a chap named Douglas Abrams, and in the book, he recorded ever so beautifully the stories, the conversations, the ideas, the emotions and the humour of the great Dalai Lama and the wonderful Reverend Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when they had both attended a special weekend event in India back in 2015 to celebrate the Dalai Lama's 80th birthday. At one point in one of the many conversations recorded in the book and on the topic of communities, Archbishop Tutu says, one of the good things is realising that you are not a solitary cell. You are part of a wonderful community. He then went on to say, human beings are social animals. One individual, no matter how powerful, how clever, cannot survive without other human beings. And in yet another book, a book on the many famous quotes of Martin Luther King Jr., in which Archbishop Tutu actually wrote the introduction or foreword to the book. But on the same topic, Archbishop Tutu said, the importance of living in a community is the essence of what it is to be human. We need other human beings in order to be human. And I thought, what wonderful and powerful words these are, and how accurate and relevant such words and thoughts are, not only to our OH&S and work health safety philosophy, but also in terms of what it means to belong to a community. Unfortunately, what is happening or occurring in many of our workplace communities in Australia, and perhaps even more generally in our Australian society, I find quite disturbing, if not downright shameful. And here I talk about how we generally treat people at work, how workers are treated, and the implications that has on occupational health and safety standards and levels at the workplace. There is a constant underpayment of wages, what we in Australia are now calling wage theft in our country. The almost daily exploitation of workers, especially the most vulnerable of workers, primarily the young, the old, the non-English speaking workers, the migrants, those workers on temporary visas with the constant threat of deportation hanging over their heads. The marked increase in the numbers of transient, itinerant, part-time and casual workers. Full-time directly employed workers, that is workers employed directly by the company or the organisation, who are now constantly and regularly being replaced by casual staff, casual labour working for labour hire companies. There is an overwhelming lack of job security in Australia right now, and this has been going on for quite a while. Many Australian workers, especially those that lack any type of job security, are constantly being denied a voice in their workplace. And collective representation is becoming increasingly more difficult to implement and organise at the workplace, arguably because of the questionable and the one-sided industrial laws we currently operate under. Workers are being denied, or at the very least restricted, in their attempts to join and belong to a trade union, especially a trade union of their choosing. And many of our federal industrial laws are blatantly and quite deliberately hindering and restricting, and in some cases openly denying trade unions access to many workplaces and hence to many of their members and potential members, which is fundamentally in breach of long-standing and accepted ILO conventions. Workers are increasingly fearful of the employment ramifications if they are speaking out, or seem to be speaking out, about the conditions at their workplace, conditions including levels and standards of occupational health and safety, especially if they are seen to be speaking to a trade union about such matters. This so-called flexible business model, which has seemingly manifested itself in much of our Australian society and in many of our current industrial relation laws, appears to be based upon the exploitation of the vulnerable and the powerless, whilst focusing almost entirely on increasing the profits and the power of the powerful. Now, whilst reading this book of joy, some other words from the Dalai Lama just seem to beautifully summarise and encapsulate this whole undercurrent employment business model or corporate philosophy, where compassion and empathy with workers appears to have simply evaporated and disappeared. In the Book of Joy, the Dalai Lama is quoted as saying, "The only way to truly change the world is through teaching compassion. Our society is lacking an adequate sense of compassion, a sense of kindness, and a genuine regard for others' well-being." You see, how we treat workers and people in general becomes incredibly important, not only with the obvious emphasis on the notions of dignity and respect, but also in terms of the OH&S implications. Which leads me onto what we, or rather how we as a community, or perhaps more accurately as a workplace community, how we deal with and treat workplace issues, especially occupational health and safety issues, and how they are resolved to achieve the best and safest possible outcomes for all concerned. And indeed the power games that some people can and often do play during such discussions or negotiations. It almost becomes a game between the powerful, and in general terms I speak here of those who control the workplace and hence the employment contracts, and the powerless, often those workers without a voice and or without collective representation via a trade union. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "There is nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly." And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified with the resignation of power and power with the denial of love. Now, power properly understood is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political and economic change. What is needed is a realisation that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Now, if we add, alter, replace and adjust a few of these words, we get a very similar meaning, but in a very different context. That is, in an employment industrial context. Let me show you what I mean with the changes and additions that I've taken the liberty to make in red. There is nothing wrong with industrial power if that power is used correctly. And one of the great problems of industrial history is that the concepts of dignity and respect and industrial power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that dignity and respect is identified with the resignation of industrial power, and industrial power with the denial of dignity and respect. Now, power properly understood is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, economic and industrial change. What is needed is a realisation that industrial power without dignity and respect is reckless and abusive, and dignity and respect without industrial power is sentimental and anemic. Industrial power at its best is implementing the demands of industrial democracy, and industrial democracy at its best is industrial power correcting everything that stands against dignity and respect. Now, the definition of power is often taken to be an ability to dominate or benignly control the nature of social relations, including that of the relations at the workplace. And if certain voices are excluded from the workplace debate, such non-participation can often be mistakenly interpreted as apathy or indifference, rather than a process of exclusion in what is essentially a political process. Indeed, it is claimed that the hidden face of power is not so much about who wins or loses on an issue, but rather who is prevented from becoming involved in the discussions in the first place. So in terms of industrial democracy, workplace engagement, worker representation, worker voice, and workers being able to positively contribute and feel confident to freely involve themselves in occupational health and safety issues without the fear of any adverse employment consequences. Perhaps it's all of us here. As Stephen Hawking once said, to unleash your imagination and help shape the future. You see, I have great hope and a great belief that we can all help shape and improve the future of not only occupational health and safety at our workplaces, but also the overarching philosophy, if you like, of how workers are treated and how much dignity, respect, trust and choice we can give to and allow workers to have, especially in terms of health and safety issues. Issues that affect not only them, but also their families and their communities. Communities that we, in one form or another, all belong to. I'd like to, if I may, show you what I consider to be a most wonderful and beautiful quote that I recently read in a book called To Obama, with Love, Joy, Hate and Despair. The book itself was about how President Obama read 10 letters every night from the roughly 10,000 or so letters his Presidential Office of Correspondence received every day while he was president. And what many of those letters said, how those letters were sorted and classified, what President Obama said in his personal reply to many of these letters, and how others were replied to, and indeed how it was claimed in the book. These letters helped shape his presidency. Now, the particular quote I'm going to read and show you was cited in a letter dated July 16, 2016. It's attributed to the great and acclaimed American poet and activist Maya Angelou, and I apologise if I didn't get that pronunciation correct. It goes like this. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Now, I know that all of us here have the intellect and the intelligence to assist in and contribute to making all our workplaces healthier and safer. And in doing this, it should send a message to all workers that they are respected, that they matter, that they will be listened to, and they will be treated with dignity for whom they are, for whoever or whatever community they belong to, and that they won't be discriminated against just because they are workers and or because they are raising health and safety issues which might take a bit of work and time to resolve, but issues which ultimately could well end up saving lives. You see, all of the research, all of the literature demonstrates time and time and time again that if workers are treated with dignity and respect, if they are given the opportunity to fulfil and fully participate in workplace decision making, if they are listened to, especially over work health safety issues, not only does it prevent workplace fatalities and greatly improves the overall levels of health and safety at the workplace, but it also makes workers feel more valued and hence feel more confident. Confident to not only participate and positively engage at the workplace, but that confidence arguably extends to their ability to confidently participate and positively engage and contribute to their communities. Workers have a voice, and they need to be allowed and feel free to use that voice. And we all need to hear, listen to, and respect that voice, be it individually or collectively. As your own great modern-day American philosopher Noam Chomsky once said, you should decide whether something makes sense by its content, not by the letters after the name of the person who says it. But in reality, we can only do that if we empower those workers by showing them respect and treating them with dignity, the same levels of dignity and respect that we expect others to treat us with in general society and as general citizens. And here I find it really interesting that as a society, we allow workers, as citizens, a voice and a role in how to run their lives and their country, their state, their cities and towns, by allowing them and encouraging them to vote. And in Australia, it's actually mandatory to vote in such elections. And to elect representatives for whom that citizen allows or nominates to make decisions on their behalf in the governance of their country, state, city or town. And yet, and here I'm paraphrasing, and we'll partly quote the then Dean of Law at Sydney University, Emeritus Professor Ron McCallum, who back in 1996, when commenting on how the then Australian Conservative government unilaterally removed all provisions dealing with employee consultation from federal industrial awards, said that he found it incongruous that when Australian workers enter their workplaces and become industrial citizens, those workers have no legal right to elect a consultative body to participate in workplace governance. Indeed, not too long after that, Greg Combo, who was the then head of the ACTU, which is the peak trade union body in Australia, stated that an employer's ability to participate in decision-making at work is arguably as critical to his or her citizenship in a democracy as is the right to vote. I'd like to finally, if I may, share with you another little saying that Barack Obama said in his book, but I believe he quoted it directly from Martin Luther King Jr. And that was, we need to judge people on the content of their character. Now, once again, if we slightly alter and recontextualise that statement in the context of the workplace, we end up with, and once again I've taken the liberty to put changes in red, we need to judge workers on the content of their character and the contribution they can make, rather than perhaps just on the work they do or the jobs they perform. So in summary, respecting workers, people, treating them with dignity, treating them with honesty, trusting them, listening to them, engaging and involving them, actively demonstrating compassion and empathy with them, giving them choices and respecting those choices. Just a few issues or concepts that successful communities are arguably founded upon, and issues or concepts that I think are always worth striving for, especially at the workplace. And especially at times such as this, when we are remembering all those workers who have died at work or as a consequence of being at work. I sincerely thank you for allowing me this opportunity and giving you perhaps a somewhat slightly different Australian perspective on what is known as International Workers' Memorial Day, and perhaps what we all might be able to do differently to prevent further workplace fatalities and all the pain and suffering that such tragedies bring to so many in our communities. I very much look forward to continuing this conversation both now and in the future. So I thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Jerry, please. Let's ask some questions.
Sure.
I was interested, you were talking about the dynamic of workers in Australia, the fact that now you're seeing a lot more temporary workers or folks coming from other countries maybe that don't have citizenship. Can you speak to that a little bit more for us? Because I think we have some of that here in the United States, but I don't know how it compares, and I'm very interested in hearing more about it.
What we're seeing is a large...
Push the button. Yeah.
Thank you. This'll do. What we're seeing is a large casualisation of our Australian workforce. So the implications are obviously people on a casual job are very fearful of their employment. And as I said, that makes someone putting their hand up and saying, look, I don't think this process is safe, or I don't think this work is safe, quite vulnerable, because if they're not directly employed and they're from a labour hire company, all that employer has to do is say to the labour hire company, look, I don't want Jerry Ayres back again. We don't think we need him, but we could use someone else. And we know that happens time and time again. And it's the same with migrants, not so much that they're not welcome. They are extremely welcome. But what we find is if they're on temporary work visas, they're also vulnerable, especially if they're being sponsored by that employer. Because if they put their hand up and say, I don't feel safe, or I don't want to do this piece of work because this is really unsafe, I don't think you have to be Einstein to guess what happens to that person on that visa. They may not be sponsored, and therefore their whole life is kind of thrown out the window. So it's not so much that illegal workers are coming in. We're getting a lot of migrants, which is fantastic. They're getting work, but they may not have a full visa to work. They may be on a visitor's permit. They may be on a temporary works permit. It makes them very vulnerable and very, as I said, insecure. So it's the insecurity of work, the casualisation, the transiency of the industry. I come from the construction industry, and it's always been very transient. You go from one job to the next. What we're seeing are a lot of people who are coming on labour hire companies, and whilst they may not agree that the workplace is safe, they will have to do the work if they want to keep their job and put food on the table for their family. So that vulnerability, that insecurity of employment forces people to do things which they may not normally do or they may not agree with, but they haven't really got much of a choice. And if they haven't got a voice, or if that workplace hasn't got a union representative to be their voice and to take their concerns anonymously to the employer in full confidence that it will be fixed up, it can create all sorts of problems. And we see that every day. Why do we still have 14 deaths in America, in a first world country, every day? Why do we in Australia have so many fatalities? We're a first world country. It shouldn't happen. We have the technology, where we pride ourselves on being the clever countries, and yet we're still killing workers. 14 families are going to have an empty seat today at their Christmas table. There are going to be 14 families potentially whose children are going to wake up in the night crying for their parent, and their parent's not going to be there. You're going to have 14 families who that parent won't be able to take their child to school ever again, won't celebrate birthdays with them ever again, won't be able to hold them and cuddle them and say, it's okay, you're just feeling a bit sick, we'll take you to the doctor, you'll feel better. That's family are destroyed. That community are shattered. But we still continue on this path of almost self-destruction because of other factors.
Anyone else with any other questions?
Mike?
What advice do you have for safety professionals in helping to convey your thoughts that you've conveyed here today, in helping safety professionals convey this to upper management?
As I said, I think we've all got the intellect and the intelligence to do that, but there are different ways to do it. We have to have the courage to say no. We have to have the courage to say that process has to stop. It's clearly unsafe. You have to have the courage then not only to say that, but to say we can do better. People don't like to be told that they're wrong, but no one minds to be told that we can do things better. So we also have to have the intellect and the intelligence, which we obviously have, because you wouldn't be here otherwise, to come up with alternatives. In a role the OHS professional has, or whoever, we're going to upset people. But it's whom you upset. We're going to upset the worker if we continue to say to that employer, that's okay, you can keep going. Because eventually it's a bit like a game of probability. It's going to happen. And people don't go to work to play a game of probability. And workers don't go to work to have someone else play that game of probability on their behalf. And their families certainly don't want their workers, their loved ones to go to work when someone's playing a game of probability. Risk is about probability. But we know that probability, eventually, it happens. It's only a matter of time. So we have to be courageous, and we have to have the courage to say that process has to stop. There is a better way. In the year 2019, if we can't find better ways to do the work, where it's clearly a risk or a danger, then we probably shouldn't be doing the job. And you either upset that employer or you upset that worker and that worker's family and that worker's friends and their colleagues and their community and a whole range of people. When someone dies at work, the ripple effect is staggering. You say no to that employer, it's not that staggering. Might be a bit of a hiccup for them, might be a tiny hold-up, but most likely if there's new technology to be used, in the long term it'll probably improve that person's productivity or that organisation's productivity anyway. So we have to have the courage to say no.
Any other questions?
What advice do you have for organizations that are trying to implement some of the things you're talking about and get their workers involved, but they're fighting years and years of the stigma between, the command and control structure or the mistrust between the management and how that would work?
Yeah. My thesis was based on a few concepts, but one was trust. And you've got to have trust. Not absolute trust, because you need to have a mischievous level of being able to question people and to challenge them respectfully. But if we don't trust each other, if I, as a worker, can't trust my employer if I raise an issue because I'm frightened I'm going to get made redundant or have my shifts taken away, whatever, am I going to raise that issue? Possibly not. And as an employer, if you can't trust your workforce to at least have a say in the governance of that workplace, or at least over issues of occupational health and safety, you'd probably question what type of workplace you're running and how you're structuring that workplace. It doesn't always have to be adversarial. I think people in our pluralist society sometimes take people raising their hand and saying, I don't like it done this way, as a personal affront, rather than an opportunity to say, oh, okay, is there a better way to do things? I think we get a bit too sensitive when criticism comes our way and we clam up instead of saying, oh, okay, what do we need to talk about? And we teach our kids, I think most of us who have got children, we teach our kids to be open and communicate to us. We go home to our partners and we say, or at least some of us say, how was your day? We don't just close the door and pull the blinds down and block our ears when someone says, I have a problem at home. Why should we do that at the workplace? If your children comes to you and says, Mum or Dad, I've got a problem at school, you sit down and go, tell me about it, what's wrong? But sometimes at the workplace when a worker says, I have a problem with this process, the employer says, I don't want to hear you, just get back to work. How come? So we need to, in that situation, that workplace really needs to have a look at how they communicate, how they talk to each other, how they generally conduct their day-to-day interaction with each other. And again, that's that respect and dignity. We teach our children to have respect and dignity with people, to communicate, to be open, to be honest. And yet sometimes at the workplace, all those concepts are foreign and we forget them and they're not practiced or they're not implemented as we perhaps would want them to be implemented if our children were at school or at home. So that's a really big thing that we need to have a look at, how we talk to each other, how we talk to our workers, how we talk to our employers. Someone in the shop says, what the hell do you want? Oh, I think I'll go somewhere else, thanks. We say, oh, hi, how's your day? What would you like? Have a bit of a chat. You'll probably go back there and again and again. But you won't go back there if they slam the door in your face and pull the blind down. That's what happens sometimes in some workplaces.
Gary, this kind of following what you said,
Again, it's that issue of being able to talk to the workforce and the workforce being able to talk to management without fear, without the adverse employment consequences raising its head, and that workforce and that workplace welcoming that criticism. Because it's not criticism, it's actually the opportunity to do things maybe differently, maybe more productively, maybe better. That's the examples that we can use. And there are lots of examples of Google workplace good examples. There are lots of examples and lots of authors like Hopkins and Quinlan and David Walters and Alistair Gibb and all these other people who will give those examples. And it can be done, but there needs to be trust, there needs to be honesty, there needs to be respect, there needs to be commitment, and there needs to be an atmosphere of openness and non-fear. And again, welcoming the criticism, welcoming the inquiries and the questions. Because it's a bit like a university. People go to university to challenge and to question and to do things a little bit differently. Why shouldn't we do that at the workplace? We should challenge, we should question. We shouldn't just wholeheartedly accept that this is the only way to do the work. I mean, I hear that time and time again, we have to do it this way, it's the only other way. Really? In the year 2019, we can't do things a little bit differently? It takes a bit of courage for that employer then to say, let's sit down and let's see what we can do differently. And especially when there's been a fatality, because that is the number one sign that that system of work has failed. And it's failed everyone in that community, especially that worker and that worker's family.
If anyone has any more questions, they can email Dr. Michael Behm. Do you have a question?
I have a question from Ireland,
All right.
from the University of Ulster. If we consider management as a function, not a role, could workers be their own managers? Could you talk about that?
It'd be an interesting proposition, wouldn't it? I think sometimes it would be fairly difficult because you need someone to stand back from afar and look at how the process is going. You need someone to monitor the productivity, the progress, the quality, all of those things. So that could be a worker. It'd be an interesting project to undertake, wouldn't it? Just to see how people's attitudes might be affected if they're given different roles and different responsibilities. So yeah, everything's possible.
I won't give you the second question because it's really hard. That he asked, that's something that.
Sure. Good.
Safety manager, you're often the middleman between workers and
Yeah.
what is the best way to find a balance of trust between both sides? Safety managers have red tape and cost, different things that you deal with in the management sector, and employees don't necessarily understand that work. They have suggestions, and you're using their suggestions because they're giving them a voice on the process. How do you find that balance, build that trust?
Another good question. I think I'd rather answer Mike's question. It is a balance of trust. So I trust my worker representatives and I trust the workforce going to them and giving them ideas. I then have to have a bit of trust in what the response from the management will be. But we shouldn't probably let the perfect and the ultimate get in the way of better and improvement. And most times people will raise things because whilst they understand it's not a perfect world and you can probably never get to the perfect system or workplace, you can always improve things and make things better and make things safer. And normally OH&S solutions, as probably we all know and recognise, are a combination of a lot of things. It's never one factor which will resolve a safety issue. Like it's never one factor when there's a serious incident at the workplace. I don't call them accidents. No such thing as a workplace accident. It's a series of events which occur, and we haven't read the signs or taken the time to look at all the pre-warning and events and signals that have occurred, as I said, well before that tragic event takes place. And I think, speaking from our construction industry in Victoria, the emphasis on productivity and time is not allowing either workers or management to stand back and take that time and say, let's have a slow down and look at exactly what we're doing and what we can do better. Why did that incident happen over there, which may not have included any serious injury? Why did it happen? What were we doing? We don't take the time. I've seen incident reports and the solution is tell workers to be more careful. Or it was the worker's fault. Now that may not necessarily be untrue, but boy, is it unhelpful. It's like saying to someone who's driving, just drive a bit more carefully, will you? And you won't have an accident. But we do, which is why we have now dual carriageways, we have barriers in the road, we have airbags, we have side impact bags, we have the police out there monitoring speed. We have a whole range of factors which can help eliminate as much as we can people having road accidents. But we still have them, but we just don't say, well, we're just going to have to give drivers more education. You have to do something a little bit more. We need to do things differently, which is why our OH&S process is based upon, as you know, on a hierarchy of control. Start at the top, see if we can eliminate it all. Can't do that because we need to use this piece of machinery. Okay, if we need to use it, then how do we make it safer? Can we substitute it with something? Yes, maybe. No. If we can't, then let's go down the engineering controls. A whole range of factors. It's a bit like the whole range of factors which add up when there's an incident. You know, that causal chain of events. All we need to do is break one link in that chain and that time in space syndrome doesn't match up. So the incident doesn't happen. But that takes time and it takes patience, and often at a workplace, especially in the construction industry, we don't seem to be able to have that time because the financiers and the developers are saying to the builder, if you don't get this building up by this date, there are going to be huge financial penalties. That then transposes down to the subcontractors, which transposes down to the workers, and guess who has limited choice or no influence in the decision? The worker. Who's most at risk? The worker. So we have to somehow turn that around a little bit, and one way is to consult with those workers and ask them. And don't be fearful of being given a bit of criticism. I get a lot of criticism, but you have to wear that sometimes in the interests of being better.
Can we give a round of applause for Dr. Jerry Ayers? And on behalf of the student chapter of ASSP, we want to give you a small token of our gratitude. So thank you. And if you have any questions, you can email Dr. Michael Behm. Thank you, guys.